So civil rights will very much be at the forefront of the 1964 election. At the Democratic Convention in the summer of 1964, there's a question of how central the civil rights movement will be to the Democratic platform. In particular, a group of activists dubbing themselves the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party goes to the convention and tries to take the seats of the all-white Mississippi delegation, arguing that the Democratic Party in Mississippi was segregated and did not reflect the will of all Democratic voters in Mississippi. In their attempts to unseat the all-white delegation, activists like Fannie Lou Hamer testify on television about their experiences growing up in the segregated South to try to argue their point about the validity of seating the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party members instead. Democrats did not want to completely alienate white Southerners who they needed to successfully vote for Lyndon Baines Johnson. So they compromised and they proposed seating two of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party members and replaced two of the white delegates. Neither side saw this as an effective compromise, and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party rejected this compromise altogether. Now, despite the drama at the Democratic National Convention, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who would become the nominee running for his first elected term after finishing Kennedy's term, is going up against a rather radical Republican candidate in Barry Goldwater from Arizona. Barry Goldwater had published a book called The Conscience of a Conservative in 1960, in which he argued for a more aggressive prosecution of the Cold War. And he specifically also, echoing both new conservatives and libertarians, wanted to shrink the size of the federal government and particularly target welfare programs for elimination, dubbing them dangerous to the state. Goldwater will famously declare that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. So for Goldwater, if your goal was noble or correct, that justified whatever methods you used to achieve that goal. Goldwater has a group called Young Americans for Freedom who mobilize voters for him. This is a group of conservative college students whose founding document, the Sharon Statement, highlights their commitment to a small government and a free market, and that those would guarantee personal freedoms. Many of Goldwater's supporters in the election of 1964 wanted to not only put Goldwater in office, but also get rid of Republicans who they felt were too friendly to big government and New Deal programs. And in the election of 1964, many people saw Goldwater as potentially the successor to John Foster Dulles, right? And his idea of massive retaliation, that we would be willing to escalate very quickly any kind of conflict into a nuclear engagement. And so Lyndon Baines Johnson runs an ad based on this. His campaign runs the infamous Daisy ad, which is probably the most famous political ad in American history. So the Daisy ad airs on television, and it depicts a cute little white girl, probably about 5 or so years old at most, picking daisies. And she, of course, is playing the game He Loves Me, He Loves Me Not, right, as she's plucking the petals off this daisy. And then she starts to count down in the daisy. And it's adorable because she can't really count. She says 9 twice, if I remember correctly. And then all of a sudden, her voice in counting is replaced by a very heavily Southern accented voice counting down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, lift off. And then you see the image of the girl frozen and it zeroes in on her eye. And in her eye, you see a nuclear blast. And basically, the message of the ad was vote for Johnson because Goldwater's going to bomb us back to the Stone Age. And in fact, the end of the ad tells voters, go out and vote. It's too important to stay home. Johnson will handily defeat Goldwater, again, mostly over concerns about Goldwater ramping up the Cold War. But Goldwater is more successful in the South, already highlighting this Southern reluctance to follow the Democratic Party on their civil rights platform. And this will pave the way for Nixon's 1968 campaign to adopt what is called the Southern strategy, or to appeal to these white, then Democratic voters who were dissatisfied with the direction of the National Party. So Johnson becomes president in his first outright election in 1964. And Lyndon Baines Johnson is primarily concerned with domestic policy, which you can understand looking at his background. So Johnson is from Central Texas, okay, from the Hill Country. And when Johnson was a young man coming of age during the Great Depression, he took one of his first jobs out of college working as a school teacher in a Jim Crow segregated school. So he was teaching students who were African American, Mexican American, Native American. And at the time during the Great Depression, the Hill Country is one of the poorest regions in Texas. And he's teaching the poorest kids in the poorest region of Texas. So Johnson sees just how much segregation is impacting his students. He sees just how much good New Deal policies do when they start to become effective in Central Texas. And so this leads Johnson to a lifelong belief in the power of government to help the less fortunate. So, in many ways, Johnson's formative moment as a young man, witnessing the positive effects in the New Deal, is going to drive him and his domestic policy towards trying to also want to expand access to rights and benefits to those in the working and lower classes. Unfortunately for Johnson, who would rather just focus on domestic policy, his foreign policy will be defined by Vietnam. So let's look first at Johnson's domestic policy. So Johnson pays attention to the protests like Freedom Summer in 1964 and the violence still facing people trying to register Black voters across the South. The Selma March to raise awareness of voting rights also highlights, again, the real risk of violence facing civil rights protesters. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 will finally allow federal officials to register voters, sidestepping state and local officials who frequently refused to register African American voters. And shortly following that, the 24th Amendment to the Constitution officially bans poll taxes, which had been used to eliminate poor people from voting and had disproportionately affected communities of color. Johnson's domestic policy also included the first systematic revision to immigration policy in decades. The Hart-Celler Act of 1965 demolishes the old quota system set up by the Johnson-Reed Act in 1924 and instead comes up with an immigration policy that privileges family reunification. So if you already had family members here who could sponsor you, and also highlighted skills in selecting immigrants, so trying to attract more highly skilled immigrants. The law does establish a quota for people coming in from the Americas. So the 1924 legislation had actually exempted people coming from the Americas from quotas, but now the Hart-Celler Act adds those quotas. So immigrants from the Americas are limited to only 120,000 immigrants a year. And the Hart-Celler Act also establishes special provisions for refugees from communist countries, again, allowing for people to come based on a complaint of political persecution due to their non-communist beliefs. Really, Johnson's baby, though, is the Great Society. This is Johnson's version of a New Deal. The Great Society was a system of social programs pushed by Johnson between 1965 and 1967. And this was both an expansion of existing New Deal agencies and programs and also additions to try to support these same kinds of goals. So, for example, we're going to see an expansion of Medicare and Medicaid during this time period. We're going to have new departments established, like the Department of Transportation and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, which is going to supervise access to housing in urban areas. The federal government will finally get a permanent agency dealing with employment discrimination. The Equal Employment Opportunities Commission is going to finally systematically address discrimination in employment. Remember, before we mentioned that there was a temporary agency that did that, the Fair Employment Practices Commission, during World War II, but they have been disbanded after the war. And Johnson's programs are largely supported because this is a time of economic prosperity. And so the belief was, because the economy was good, because the vast majority of Americans were doing well, that we really should try our best to help take care of our most vulnerable citizens in our communities. And in fact, despite the prosperity in general in the United States, there was still a lot of people struggling with poverty. Johnson declared a war on poverty as part of this Great Society program. And Michael Harrington's book, The Other America, published in 1962, did a lot to bring poverty to mainstream awareness, making Americans aware of the fact that between 40 and 50 million Americans still struggled with poverty in the early 1960s. Now, during the Great Depression, a lot of conversations over poverty had centered around the fact that the economic system was broken. So, in other words, poor people were poor because the system was screwed up. Okay, that we had unregulated capitalism, and this had exacerbated things like poor working wages and poor working conditions. The war on poverty, however, highlighted what they felt was the cause of poverty, which was an absence of skills and good work habits. So for them, poor people were poor because they lacked the skills to be competitive in the economic marketplace. So this is where we're going to see the introduction of the food stamps, or what we today call WIC, to help people who needed access to food. The Head Start program to try to give children access to early education, to be able to, again, make them, and the idea, the thought process, more competitive eventually in the workplace. Job training and college scholarships for students from poor backgrounds, again, to be able to set them up, hopefully, with a more prosperous job. And somewhat unusually, Johnson's administration enlisted the people it was designed to help to create and guide these policies. So they didn't just say, here, poor people, we're going to do these things for you. They sought to get feedback on the design and the effectiveness of these programs from the people that they were serving. The war on poverty does work. It did reduce the poverty rate from 22% to 13%. But as Johnson starts to see, this is not an even reduction of the poverty rate. It's still very difficult to make a significant dent of poverty, particularly in urban areas. So these policies were not affecting, say, poor white folks in rural areas, poor Black folks in urban areas the same ways. Johnson begins to talk about freedom and equality. And particularly, he resurrects that idea of freedom from want that Roosevelt had talked about as one of his 4 freedoms speeches. And he recognizes that white poverty and Black poverty oftentimes look different, that their conditions are different, that the opportunities they will have to get out of poverty are frequently different. And so Johnson stresses the importance of equality of condition, that we need to make sure that everybody has a basic standard of life, because not everybody has equality of opportunity, right? Not everybody has that equal shot at economic success. Unfortunately for Johnson, we're going to see that you can only do so much in so little time, and the government can only accomplish so much with these programs. So Johnson is going to face a much more difficult problem than poverty, although poverty is very difficult. Part of the reasons why we're not really going to have the poverty rate reduce any further from 13% is that Johnson is going to become increasingly occupied with what's happening in Vietnam and dealing with the Vietnam War. So we're going to talk about that in a future session, particularly when we come back next time. We're going to start talking about the Black Power movement, so how the civil rights movement starts to shift into a more radical direction, largely driven by young people in urban environments. And we're also going to talk about how the United States gets dragged even further into the Vietnam conflict and how Vietnam really upends Lyndon Johnson's presidency and his domestic policy. Until next time, I'm Dr. Esmacher.